The door to the Maddox ranch house flew open with enough force to rattle the jars of preserved peaches on the kitchen shelf, and Edna Maddox did not flinch. She stood at the stove with her back to the intrusion, a cast-iron skillet in her right hand, and she let 3 full seconds of silence pass before she turned around. Abraham Ramsey filled the doorway like a storm front rolling across the Texas panhandle. He was broad across the shoulders, sun-darkened, with jaw muscles tight enough to crack walnuts. His hat was pulled low, his duster was coated in trail dust, and his dark eyes held the particular brand of cold fury that men cultivate when they believe they are in the right, and intend to prove it through sheer mass alone. He was 26 years old and had never once in his life been told to sit down by a woman who meant it. "You Edna Maddox," he said, and the words came out like a challenge, like a loaded revolver set on a table between 2 men who both think they are faster. "Last time I checked," she said. He stepped inside without being invited. He looked at the kitchen, at the papers spread across her small table, at the deed documents she had been studying all morning, and his expression shifted from contempt to something sharper, something that recognized what it was looking at and did not like it one bit. "My father sent me," he said. "Cyrus Ramsey, you know who that is?" "I know who that is," Edna said. She set the skillet down on the iron trivet next to the stove, took her time about it, and turned to face him fully. She was 24 years old, 5'5", with calloused hands and dark auburn hair pinned back with a single tortoiseshell comb that had belonged to her mother. Her eyes were hazel, and they did not waver. "Sit down, Mr. Ramsey." The words hung in the air of that small, sun-filled kitchen like smoke from a just-fired gun. He stared at her. She looked back at him with the patient, immovable expression of a woman who has buried a father, fought off a county assessor, survived 3 Texas droughts, and still managed to get the morning's biscuits perfect. She pulled out a chair from the kitchen table and pointed at it. "I made coffee," she said. "It is hot and it is strong, and we are going to talk like people, not like whatever it is you came here planning to do. Sit down." And Abraham Ramsey, the son of the most feared cattle baron in Harlan County, Texas, in the autumn of 1882, sat down. He never left. But to understand why, you have to go back to the beginning, because nothing about what happened between Edna Maddox and Abraham Ramsey was simple, and nothing about it was fast, and the love that grew between them was the kind that only grows in difficult soil, where something has broken the ground open first. 6 months before Abraham showed up in her doorway, Edna's father, Robert Maddox, had died in his sleep on a Tuesday in April. He was 58 years old. He had worked the same 400 acres of grassland south of the Cimarron River his entire adult life, and he had died owing a debt that Edna did not know about until the county clerk, a narrow-faced man named Percival Hatch, came calling 2 days after the funeral with a sheaf of papers and an apologetic expression that did not reach his eyes. The debt was to Cyrus Ramsey. $3,000, borrowed 4 years prior when a drought killed half the Maddox cattle and the other half needed expensive veterinary medicines from a doctor who had to be brought all the way from Amarillo. Robert Maddox had been too proud to ask the bank, too proud to ask his neighbors, and too desperate to refuse when Cyrus Ramsey offered. The terms of the loan were documented in a contract that Robert had signed in a moment of crisis and perhaps had not read carefully enough. The interest rate was punishing. By the time Robert died, the debt had grown to $4,700. Edna had exactly $412 in the tin box under her floorboards, the deed to the ranch, 300 head of cattle, and a neighbor named Clyde Briggs who was 63 years old and had a bad hip and helped her when he could. She had spent the months since the funeral working the ranch harder than she had ever worked it, pushing cattle to market, negotiating her own deals in town, learning by necessity every piece of ranch business she had previously watched her father handle. She was not helpless. She had never been helpless. But the debt was a stone hung around the neck of everything she was trying to build, and she could feel it pulling. Cyrus Ramsey had not pushed immediately. He was a patient man in the way that large predators are patient. He let the grief settle. He let the spring planting happen. He let the first cattle drive of the year go through. And then, in late September of 1882, he sent his son. Abraham had grown up watching his father acquire things: land, cattle, water rights, businesses, people. Cyrus Ramsey was 60 years old and had built an empire of roughly 12,000 acres in Harlan County by being smarter than the people around him, less scrupulous than the law required, and perfectly willing to use the written word as a weapon when a physical one was inconvenient. He loved his son in the way that men who love power tend to love their children, as extensions of themselves, as instruments, as heirs to be shaped rather than people to be known. Abraham had ridden out to the Maddox ranch that morning with a clear mission. His father had explained it simply over breakfast the previous day. The Maddox woman cannot pay. She will not be able to pay by the 1st of November, which is the date specified in the contract. When that date arrives, the land defaults to me. But I do not want a legal battle. Legal battles take time and money and create enemies among men who might otherwise be useful. Go out there and make her understand that she should sign the deed over now, voluntarily, in exchange for my forgiveness of the remaining debt. Make her understand it clearly. His father had not needed to explain what clearly meant. Abraham had grown up watching men leave his father's office with the particular hollow expression of people who had just understood something clearly. He had ridden the 12 miles to the Maddox ranch that morning telling himself it was just business. He had told himself that the woman had inherited a losing situation, that the land would be better managed under the Ramsey operation, that he was actually doing her a favor by offering the debt forgiveness. He had told himself these things and he had believed most of them, and then he had walked through that door and looked at Edna Maddox standing at her stove, turning to face him without flinching, and something in the architecture of his certainty had shifted slightly. He could not have said exactly what it was. Perhaps it was the steadiness in her eyes. Perhaps it was the way she had set down the skillet with such deliberate calm, as if she had been expecting something like him, and had already decided how she was going to handle it. Perhaps it was simply that she had pointed at a chair and told him to sit down in her kitchen, and there had been so little fear in the gesture that his prepared speech about business realities and legal consequences had suddenly felt cheap. He sat. She poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set one in front of him and sat down across the table with the other, and she looked at the papers between them and then looked at him. "Your father wants the land," she said. "My father wants resolution," Abraham said, which was the version he had rehearsed. "Your father wants the land," she said again, patient as river water. "I understand that. I have been expecting it. What I want to know is whether you are here because you agree with him or because he told you to come." The question landed somewhere unexpected. He looked at her. She looked back at him and waited. "I am here on behalf of the Ramsey Ranch," he said. "That is not what I asked," she said. There was a silence in which the kitchen clock ticked 8 times. Outside, through the window, the October wind moved the dry grass in long, whispering waves, and a crow called once from somewhere in the direction of the barn. "He sent me," Abraham said finally. "He wants you to sign the deed over voluntarily. In exchange, he will forgive the remaining debt." $4,700, she said. "Yes. In exchange for 400 acres, a working water source, and access to the South Cimarron grazing land, which your father has wanted since before I was born." He did not answer, which was itself an answer. Edna wrapped both hands around her tin cup and looked out the window for a moment. She was not afraid. He could see that clearly now. She was calculating, with the precise, unhurried attention of someone who has had a great deal of practice making decisions with inadequate information and insufficient time. "I am not going to sign it," she said. "Miss Maddox." "I am not going to sign it," she said again, and turned her eyes back to him, and they were not angry, they were simply certain. "Not today, Not on the 1st of November, not at any point before I have exhausted every other option available to me. But I want to be honest with you, which is something I expect you did not anticipate this morning." She pulled one of the papers from the stack on the table and slid it toward him. It was a letter, dated 2 weeks prior, from a cattle buyer in Wichita named Horatio Penn. Abraham read it without picking it up. It was an offer, a good one, significantly above the current market rate, for 150 head of Maddox cattle to be delivered before December 1st. "If that sale goes through," she said, "I can pay down nearly half the debt. The remaining sum I can negotiate with your father directly with a concrete payment schedule. I know the law, Mr. Ramsey. I have read every word of that contract 3 times. There is no provision that prevents a partial payment followed by a formal restructuring, provided the debtor acts in good faith before the default date." She had read the contract 3 times. He sat back slightly and looked at the woman across from him and thought with an honesty that surprised him that his father had made a miscalculation in sending him here to intimidate her. "My father is unlikely to agree to a restructured payment," he said. "I know that," she said, "which is why I am telling you and not him, at least for now." Another silence. The wind pressed against the window glass. "Why?" he said. She studied him for a moment, with the same careful, measuring attention she had given the letter from the cattle buyer. "Because you came in here ready to deliver a threat," she said, "and you sat down instead. That tells me something." Abraham Ramsey looked at Edna Maddox across the small kitchen table in the morning light of a Texas October, and the prepared speech his father had given him dissolved entirely, and something else, something he could not have named yet, began in the place where it had been. He picked up his coffee cup. He drank. "Tell me about this cattle buyer," he said. She told him. She told him about Horatio Penn and the Wichita market and the specific grade of cattle she was preparing to drive north. And as she talked, she became more animated, not excited exactly, but engaged, the way a person becomes when they are speaking about something they have genuinely mastered. She knew her cattle. She knew the grasses they had grazed on and how that affected the meat quality, and what buyers in the northern markets paid premium prices for, and how to negotiate a contract without a broker taking a commission. He had grown up on a ranch. He knew cattle. He found himself listening not with the polite attention of someone waiting to deliver their own point, but with the genuine focus of someone who is learning something they did not expect to learn. When she finished, he said, "You need a trail boss for a drive like that." "I have Clyde Briggs," she said. "Clyde Briggs is 63 years old and has a hip problem," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because my father knows everything about this land and the people on it," he said. "It is how he operates." A shadow moved across her face. Not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that settles into a person when they fully understand the shape of the threat they are facing. "Then you understand that I am not in a position of strength," she said quietly. "I understand that you are in a more complicated position than you are letting on," he said. "Yes," she said, "that is true. But I am also not beaten yet." He set down the cup and looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window at a low angle and catching the auburn in her hair, and she was looking back at him with that steady, unreadable patience, and Abraham Ramsey made a decision that had nothing to do with his father's instructions and everything to do with something he could not yet explain. "I can help you with the drive," he said. The word surprised them both. Edna blinked. Just once, just barely. "Why would you do that?" "Because," he said, and paused, and was honest in a way that he had not planned to be. "I am not sure my father is in the right here, and I would like to think about it for a while before I do something that cannot be undone." She studied him for a long time. Outside, the wind moved the grass. "You can sleep in the barn," she said finally. "There is a cot behind the tack room. You can start helping Clyde tomorrow morning." And that was how it began. The days that followed had a quality that Abraham could not quite categorize. He had spent his whole life on a large, efficiently run cattle operation with a dozen hands and a cook, and a clear hierarchy in which his father occupied the top position, and everyone else arranged themselves accordingly. The Maddox Ranch was something different. It was small and it was tired, and it was, in a way that he found oddly affecting, deeply personal. Everything on it bore the mark of the people who had cared for it. The fences were repaired in a dozen different ways, evidence of years of improvisation. The barn had a section of newer wood on the south wall where something had damaged the original planking, and the replacement boards were slightly lighter, not quite matching, a reminder of a specific hard moment that had been overcome. The garden behind the kitchen was productive and well-tended in a way that spoke of genuine attention and love. He worked alongside Clyde Briggs, who accepted his presence with the philosophical calm of a man who has seen too much to be surprised by anything. Clyde had been on the Maddox property since before Edna was born. He had known Robert Maddox well and had a respectful, careful grief about the man that expressed itself in silence rather than words. He told Abraham on the second day, while they were restringing a fence line on the north pasture, that Robert Maddox had been an honest man who made one bad choice in a moment of desperation, and that the woman up at the house had inherited the consequence of it and was handling it with more grace than most men he knew would have. Abraham did not say anything in response. He drove another fence staple and thought about what Clyde had said. Edna herself was the kind of presence that a person feels without entirely understanding why. She did not go out of her way to engage him. She was busy, genuinely busy, with 1,000 daily tasks that keeping a working ranch alive requires, and she folded him into the work schedule as practically as if she had hired him through the regular channel. She gave clear instructions and did not repeat herself. She was fair and she was direct, and she had an extremely good sense of humor that appeared without warning, usually in the form of a dry observation delivered in the same tone as everything else, so that it took you a moment to realize she had made a joke. He caught himself watching for it, waiting for the moment when that deadpan delivery would produce something that made him want to laugh. On the fourth evening, she brought supper out to the barn, which she had apparently done for Clyde as a habit on long work days, and the three of them ate together on the barn steps in the cooling October air, tin plates balanced on their knees, watching the last of the light go out of the sky over the western ridge. Clyde talked about the cattle he had driven 40 years ago before his hip had stopped being reliable, and Edna listened with the attentive, genuine interest of someone who has heard the story before and still finds it worth hearing again. And Abraham sat between them and felt something unfamiliar, which was the sensation of being somewhere he had not planned to be and finding that he did not want to leave. On the 6th day, a man came from his father. His name was Tully Greer, and he was one of the Ramsey ranch hands, a thick-set, loyal man who had worked for Cyrus Ramsey for 11 years and was the kind of person his father used to deliver messages that were not exactly messages. He rode up to the Maddox yard in the early afternoon when Abraham was in the south pasture cutting out the cattle for the drive, and he did not come to the pasture but waited at the house. Abraham saw him from a distance and felt something cold settle in his chest. He came back to the yard. Tully touched his hat brim and said, "Your father would like to speak with you, tonight if possible." "Tell him I will come at the end of the week," Abraham said. Tully looked at him steadily. He said, "Tonight." Abraham looked at the house. Edna was standing on the porch, watching. She was too far to read her expression, but her posture was that particular stillness that happens when a person is very carefully not reacting to something that worries them. "Tell him I will come in 3 days," Abraham said. "I am occupied." Tully rode back the way he had come. Abraham walked to the house. He climbed the porch steps, and Edna looked at him and said, "You need to go." "I do not need to go," he said. "Abraham." It was the first time she had used his given name. He noticed it immediately. "Your father is going to become suspicious. If he thinks you have changed sides, this becomes much more complicated." "I have not changed sides," he said. "I'm trying to figure out which side I am on." She looked at him with those steady hazel eyes, and he could see that she understood him, in the uncanny way that some people simply understand what you mean even when you have not said it well. "Then be careful while you figure it out," she said, "because he is not a patient man and you are his son and he will use you if he needs to." He went the next morning. He rode the 12 miles back to the Ramsey Ranch, which was called the Circle R and was, by every objective measure, an impressive operation. The main house was a 2-story clapboard structure painted white, with a wide porch and proper glass windows and a separate cookhouse and bunkhouse, and a stable large enough for 30 horses. When Abraham arrived, Cyrus Ramsey was waiting on the front porch with a glass of whiskey and an expression that suggested the whiskey was not his first of the day. Cyrus was a large man, still physically imposing at 60, with white hair and pale blue eyes and the permanent squint of someone who has spent 60 years looking at open horizons. He had never struck Abraham. He had never needed to. The weight of his displeasure was sufficient to produce compliance in most people without the application of anything physical. "Sit down," his father said, which was funny, Abraham thought, because 2 people had told him to sit down in the last week and only one of them had meant it kindly. He sat in the other porch chair. His father studied him. "What is the situation?" his father said. "Complicated," Abraham said. "Simplify it." "She is not going to sign the deed over," Abraham said. "She has a legitimate cattle sale pending with a buyer in Wichita. If it goes through, she can pay down roughly half the debt before November 1st. She intends to request a formal restructuring of the remaining sum." His father was quiet for a moment. "That is not what I sent you there to accomplish." "No," Abraham said. "What have you been doing out there for a week?" "Helping with the drive preparation." His father looked at him with those pale eyes, and Abraham held the look without dropping it, which was itself a small act of rebellion, because in the Ramsey household it was understood that you did not hold Cyrus Ramsey's gaze when he was displeased. You look somewhere else and let the storm pass. "You are helping her," his father said. "I am thinking," Abraham said. "About what?" "About whether this is right," Abraham said. "Forcing a woman off land she has worked her whole life because her father made a bad choice in a desperate moment seems business," his father said, with a sharpness that closed the word like a door. "I offered him fair terms. He agreed. He could not perform. Those are the facts." "The interest rate is not fair," Abraham said. The silence that followed was the kind that has a texture to it, like weather you can feel on your skin before it fully arrives. "Go back to the ranch," his father said. "Tell her the deadline stands. November 1st, or we proceed through the county court, and that will be public and unpleasant, and she will lose the land anyway, but more slowly and with the entire county watching." Abraham stood up. He put on his hat. He looked at his father for a moment and thought about all the things he might say, and then he thought about Edna Maddox standing in her kitchen with the morning light on her face, telling him she was not beaten yet, and he said, "I will deliver the message." He rode back to the Maddox ranch. He arrived in the late afternoon when the light was turning gold and long over the pastures, and Edna came out of the barn when she heard him ride in, wiping her hands on her work apron. She looked at his face and said, "Bad." "He is not moving on the deadline," Abraham said. "He threatened to take it through the county court if you do not sign by November 1st. Public," he said. "Unpleasant." Her jaw tightened just slightly. "How long until the cattle reach Wichita?" he asked. "The drive is 12 days at a steady pace," she said. "If we leave by October 15th, we arrive in plenty of time. But the contract with Penn has to be signed before we leave, which means getting a courier to Wichita and back." "I know a faster route north than the main trail," Abraham said. "I drove cattle up from the Cimarron on it 3 years ago. Cuts 2 days off the travel time." She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, something that was not quite gratitude and not quite trust but was somewhere between the two, a movement in the direction of both. "You do not have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. "Your father will not like it." "I know that too." A pause. An October crow calling from the fence post at the edge of the yard. The last of the gold light on the top of the barn. "Why?" she said. Just that word. The same word she had asked him the first morning. He thought about it honestly. He was an honest person fundamentally in the way that some people are regardless of the environment that shaped them, as if honesty is a thing built into the bone. "Because I think you are the most capable person I have ever met," he said, "and I think watching your father's mistake take everything from you would be a wrong that I could prevent, and I do not want to be the kind of man who prevents a wrong and chooses not to." She looked at him for a long time with those hazel eyes. "That is a good reason," she said finally. They sent the courier to Wichita the next morning. The 2 weeks leading up to the drive were the most alive that Abraham could remember feeling in a very long time. He threw himself into the preparation with an energy that surprised even Clyde, who was not easily surprised, and that produced in Edna a kind of quiet, watchful appreciation that expressed itself in small ways. An extra piece of pie after supper. A genuine smile offered without the usual careful calculation. Her hand resting briefly on his arm one morning when he solved a problem with a particularly difficult piece of sorting equipment. Just a touch, barely 3 seconds, and she probably did not even fully notice she had done it, but he noticed, and it stayed with him for the rest of the day like warmth from a fire that has died down but has not gone out. They talked in the evenings, after Clyde had retired, sitting on the porch steps with their coffee. She told him about growing up on the ranch, about her mother who had died of fever when Edna was 12, about learning to read cattle the way other children learn to read books, about the specific pride and specific loneliness of being a woman running a business that the world around her persistently pretended she was not capable of running. He told her things he had not told many people. About growing up in the shadow of his father's expectations, about the particular freedom and particular loneliness of being the heir to something large, about the creeping awareness he had been living with for the last several years, that the business he was being trained to inherit involved practices that he was not comfortable with, debts pressed too hard, water rights acquired through legal maneuvering that bordered on theft, small operations squeezed until they broke. "Did you never say anything to him?" She asked one evening. "I have said things," he said. "He hears them as weakness." "They are not weakness," she said. "No," he agreed, "they are not." The courier returned from Wichita on the 12th of October with a signed contract from Horatio Penn. Edna read it at the kitchen table with Abraham and Clyde watching, and when she set it down her expression was the careful, contained version of relief, the kind that comes to people who have survived enough to know that relief should be held lightly because circumstances can change. 150 head, she said. At the agreed price, this nets $2,100 after costs. Enough to pay roughly half, Abraham said. Yes. She tapped her fingers on the table once, twice, and then she looked up. I need to negotiate with your father before the drive. I need him to agree in writing to accept the payment as partial and to restructure the remainder. He will refuse, Abraham said. I know, she said, but I need to ask him first on the record so that when this goes to the county court, which it may, the judge can see that I acted in good faith. She had thought of everything. He sat back and looked at her with a feeling that was past admiration into something considerably warmer and considerably more specific. I will come with you, he said. To your father's house, she said. Yes, she studied him. That is going to be interpreted as a statement. Yes, he said, I know. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, You understand that I have not asked you to choose sides. I understand that, he said. I am choosing for my own reasons. Tell me one of them, she said, and her voice was quiet, just the two of them on the porch with the night insects going and the stars heavy overhead, and the question was not a test or a trap. It was a real question, asked by a real person who wanted a real answer. He thought about the careful, honest answer, and then he gave it. Because every morning for the last 2 weeks I have come out of that barn, and the first thing I have wanted to do is find out where you are, he said. And that seems like a good enough reason to me. In the silence that followed, Edna Maddox looked at the stars over the Texas panhandle and said nothing for a long time, and he let her say nothing because she was someone who needed space to think, and he had learned that about her and had found that he valued it rather than being frustrated by it. "Abraham," she said finally. "Yes. I am going to concentrate on the drive first." "Yes," he said. "That is exactly right." But she did not move away from him on the step, and their shoulders stayed touching in the cool October dark, and that was its own kind of answer. The visit to Cyrus Ramsey the following day was exactly as difficult as Abraham had expected and exactly as dignified as Edna had intended. She presented herself at the Ramsey house with a folder of papers: the loan contract, the Wichita purchase agreement, a written proposal for debt restructuring, and a letter from a Harlan County attorney named James Price confirming the legal basis for her request. She sat in Cyrus Ramsey's study, across the large mahogany desk that he used specifically because it made visitors feel small, and she laid her papers out in front of her with the calm organization of someone who has prepared for every version of this conversation. Cyrus looked at her. He looked at his son, who was standing to one side with his arms crossed. He looked at the papers. "You drove a hard night to come here," he said. 12 miles, she said. "I am used to riding." He almost smiled. Cyrus Ramsey appreciated capability even in people he was trying to dispossess. It was one of his more complicated qualities. He read the restructuring proposal. He read it slowly all the way through, which surprised her. She had not expected him to read it at all. "The interest rate on the restructured sum," he said. "You have it at 4%. That is the legal maximum under Texas state law for restructured agricultural debt," she said. "I had Mr. Price check it." Cyrus looked at his son again. Abraham looked back at him steadily. "I will consider it," Cyrus said. "I would like your answer before October 15th, Edna said. "I leave on the drive that morning." "You are driving the cattle yourself?" "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment with those pale eyes, and then he looked at his son, and whatever passed between them was too quiet for anyone else to hear, but it was significant. "You will have my answer by the 14th, he said. Edna gathered her papers. She rose from the chair. She said, "Thank you for your time, Mr. Ramsey," which was exactly as formal as the situation required and not 1 degree warmer. They rode back to the Maddox ranch in the late afternoon sun, side by side, and Abraham said, "That went better than I expected." "He is going to say no," she said. "I know," he said, "but he respected you, and that matters." "Why does that matter if the answer is no?" she said, not bitterly, just practically. "Because men like my father respect people who stand up to them," he said. "It does not always change what they do, but it changes how they do it. He will think twice about dragging this through the county court publicly. He does not want the county to see him press a woman off her dead father's land over a loan with a usurious interest rate." She considered this. "You know him well." "I have had 26 years of study," he said. Something passed across her face then, something that was not quite sympathy but was close to it, the kind of recognition that comes when one person understands the specific weight another person has been carrying. "Is it difficult?" she said. Being his son, he thought about lying or at least softening it. He chose not to. "Sometimes," he said, "when I know what he is doing is wrong and I cannot stop it." "Like now," she said. "Like now," he agreed. "Although now I am at least trying." She looked at him, riding beside her in the last of the October sun, and whatever she saw in his face decided something in her, because when they got back to the ranch and he was unsaddling his horse, she came into the barn and stood in the stall doorway and said, "Abraham." He turned. "Thank you," she said. "Not as a business arrangement, just thank you." He looked at her in the quiet of the barn, with the smell of hay and horses and the low sound of the cattle settling in the pasture beyond, and he said, "You are welcome, Edna." They looked at each other for a moment, just a moment, in the specific suspended way of two people who are both very aware that something is growing between them and both very determined to honor the timing. And then the moment passed, and she went back to the house, and he finished with his horse, and the evening came on quiet and full of stars. Cyrus Ramsey's answer arrived on the 14th of October, delivered not by Tully Greer this time, but by a lawyer. a man named Garrett Holland who worked exclusively for the Ramsey operation. It was a formal document, countersigned in the presence of a notary, and it agreed to a restructured payment plan on the following terms: the payment of $2,100 upon completion of the cattle drive, and the remaining sum restructured at 6% over 18 months, which was slightly above what Edna had proposed but within a range she could work with. There was a note attached in Cyrus Ramsey's own handwriting. It said, "I expect the payment within 7 days of completion of the Wichita sale. If it is late by even 1 day, the original contract terms apply. Cr." Edna read the document 3 times. Then she looked up at Abraham, who had been standing beside the kitchen table watching her face. "He agreed," she said. "Yes," Abraham said. "More or less on my terms," she said. "Close enough," he said. She put the papers down flat on the table with both palms and let out a single, slow, controlled breath, and that small release was all the emotion she allowed herself. But Abraham saw it, and he saw what it meant. The long months of fear and work and refusing to be beaten concentrated into that single exhale, and something in his chest did a thing that he had not experienced before. A sharp, sweet, aching kind of tenderness that he recognized, in the way that one recognizes something important. As love, he did not say so. The timing was still not right. They had a cattle drive to complete. They left at first light on October 15th with 150 head of cattle, 2 horses each, Clyde Briggs on a steady bay mare, 2 young hands Edna had hired for the drive, brothers named Felix and Marcus Doan, who were 19 and 22 respectively, and proved to be tireless workers, and enough provisions in the supply wagon to last 3 weeks. Edna drove the supply wagon herself for the first 2 days, then handed it off to Felix when she needed to ride the herd. Abraham's knowledge of the alternate northern route proved to be exactly as valuable as he had promised. The trail cut through a section of open grassland that most drivers avoided because it required crossing a shallow section of the Red River, but in October that crossing was manageable and the time saved was considerable. The cattle moved well. The weather held. The days on the trail developed their own rhythm. Early starts in the cold dawn dark. The long steady push through the day with the cattle spread across the land in that particular loose formation that experienced drivers know to read like a language, evening camp with a fire and hot food, and the specific exhaustion that comes from physical work done well. Abraham and Edna rode together more often than not. The work required it, or at least provided an excuse for it, because when you are reading a herd and responding to its movements, having 2 experienced people in communication is simply more efficient. But there was also the other thing, the thing that had nothing to do with efficiency, the fact that they sought each other's company in the natural, unself-conscious way of people who have stopped pretending they do not want it. They talked about everything. She asked about his time away from the ranch, which surprised him, because she had clearly done some thinking about him and wondered about his life before this. He told her about the 2 years he had spent in Abilene before coming back to the Circle R, working for a smaller operation, learning the industry independently from his father's influence, reading in the evenings, taking what books he could find from a small lending collection maintained by the local church. He had read Dickens, and he had read a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he had read the complete works of a botanist who had cataloged every plant species in the Texas territory, which he had found unexpectedly fascinating. She laughed at that, a real laugh, full and warm, one of the few times he had heard it without the dry wit framing it, and he thought the sound of it was worth more than most things he owned. She told him about her own reading, which had been conducted largely by lamplight after her father went to sleep, because Robert Maddox believed that reading was for Sundays and rainy days, and his daughter had more productive things to do, which meant she had read exactly as much as she wanted to and simply done it quietly. She liked history. She liked accounts of people who had navigated enormous circumstances with limited resources, explorers, pioneers, people who had figured out the rules of an unfamiliar world through careful observation and refusing to quit. "You identified with them," he said. "I suppose I did," she said. "That makes sense," he said, and looked at her riding beside him in the October sun with dust on her coat and a rope coiled at her saddle horn, and added quietly, "You would have done well in any century." She glanced at him sidelong and said nothing, but a color came into her face that was not the wind. On the 9th day of the drive, there was trouble. It came in the form of two men on the ridge above the evening camp, visible in the last light of the day as silhouettes that did not belong to the landscape. Felix spotted them first and came to Abraham quietly, and Abraham went to Edna, who was at the fire with the camp coffee. She listened to the description and said, "Ramsey men or something else?" "I cannot tell at this distance," he said. She thought for a moment. "If they were going to cause trouble with the herd, they would have done it during the drive," she said. "They are watching. Whether that is your father keeping tabs on the situation or something more opportunistic, I do not know." "Either way, they do not come into camp," Abraham said. He and Marcus Doane took the overnight watch with rifles, and the two silhouettes on the ridge moved off in the dark and did not return. In the morning there were horse tracks on the ridge, two sets heading east. Not toward Wichita and not toward Harlan County either, which suggested opportunistic rather than deliberate. A pair of men who had seen a cattle drive and considered their options and decided the risks outweighed the gain. Edna had been right. She was right about the herd with a frequency that made Abraham reflect, with genuine humility, on the gap between knowing a thing and understanding it. He had always known in the abstract that women could be as capable as men in the work of ranching. He had seen it proven theoretically. But watching Edna Maddox in the specific, daily, particular reality of that cattle drive was something else. She did not perform capability. She simply exercised it, constantly and without comment, and the effect was of someone who exists in complete alignment with what they do. He loved her. He had known it since the moment in the barn the evening before they left, and he had sat with the knowledge for 2 weeks now. The way you sit with something important, quietly, without rushing it toward a decision, letting it settle into the shape of your life. They arrived in Wichita on the 27th of October, 4 days before the November 1st deadline, having cut the drive time to 12 days using Abraham's route. Horatio Penn was a large, cheerful man with a professional eye for cattle and a very prompt payment process. He walked the herd with Edna and Abraham in the stock pens on the south side of town, made 2 small adjustments to the tally based on a handful of animals that had not traveled as well as the others, and arrived at a final price that was within 3% of the contracted amount. Edna negotiated the 3% back. Abraham watched her do it, calm and informed and completely unintimidated by the fact that Horatio Penn was a successful businessman who had probably never had a woman negotiate with him directly in his professional life. She walked Penn through the quality differentials in the cattle, citing specific Gray's history, and in the end, he added 2% back and they met in the middle. She came away with $2,060 in bank drafts made out to the Maddox Ranch. They had supper in Wichita, all 5 of them, at a restaurant near the stockyards, and paid Felix and Marcus Doane their wages in full, and the 2 brothers said warm goodbyes and went off to find accommodation for the night before riding south in the morning. Clyde sat with them at supper and ate his steak with the peaceful contentment of a man who has done a hard thing and done it well. Later, when Clyde had gone to the hotel they had taken rooms at, Abraham and Edna sat in the last corner of the restaurant with cups of coffee and the particular quiet that follows the completion of something enormous. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she said. "It was your plan." "It was my plan," she agreed. "And your route and your fence skills and your knowledge of the cattle and your presence, which, I will not pretend, made the whole thing considerably less precarious." He looked at her across the table in the warm light of the restaurant in the town of Wichita, Kansas, on the 27th of October, 1882, and said, "Edna." She looked at him. "I am going to say something," he said, "and I want you to know that it is not connected to the drive or the debt or my father or any of the business circumstances of the last 3 weeks, because I want you to be able to hear it as what it actually is." She was very still. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been in love with you since somewhere around the 6th day of knowing you, and I have not said it because the timing never seemed right. But the timing is still not perfect, and I do not think it will be until I say it, so I am saying it. I am in love with you, Edna." The restaurant made its small sounds around them. Somewhere nearby, a fiddle player had started up a slow song. Edna Maddox looked at Abraham Ramsey, and for a long time she said nothing, and then she said, "I know." He felt something in his chest relax, something that had been held very carefully in place for weeks. "For how long?" he said. "Since about the 5th day," she said. "You argued with Clyde about the fencing method for 20 minutes and then tried his way and came and found me specifically to tell me Clyde had been right. That is a peculiar thing to fall in love over," he said. "It is not," she said quietly. "It is exactly the right thing. A man who can be wrong in front of people and say so honestly is a very rare thing, Abraham." He reached across the table. He set his hand over hers carefully, the way you put your hand over something valuable. Her fingers turned and closed around his. And that was all, just that, in the corner of the restaurant in Wichita, with the fiddle playing and the coffee warm and the bank drafts in her coat pocket that meant she could keep her home. They rode back to Texas the next morning, just the two of them and Clyde, who rode a respectful distance behind and seemed very interested in the horizon. They stopped at the county office in Harlan County on the 31st of October, the day before the deadline, and Edna paid the Ramsey debt in the amount of $2,060 against the outstanding balance, receiving a formal stamped receipt, and left a copy of the debt restructuring agreement on file. Then she went home. Abraham went to see his father. Cyrus Ramsey was in his study when Abraham arrived, and he looked at his son with the pale, measuring gaze that he had used Abraham's entire life, the gaze that was calculating something, always calculating. "The payment came through," Cyrus said. "Yes," Abraham said. "You helped her." "Yes." A silence. "She is not what I expected," Cyrus said. "No," Abraham said. "She rarely is." His father looked at him for a long time. "This is personal for you," he said. "It was not a question." "Yes," Abraham said. Another long silence. Outside the study window, the Circle R spread in every direction, 12,000 acres of what his father had built through a combination of genuine hard work and things that were considerably less admirable. "You are going to keep working at that ranch," his father said. "Yes," Abraham said. "That is your choice." "Yes," Abraham said. "It is." Cyrus Ramsey looked at his son, and whatever he was feeling was not visible in the way it would be visible in other men. But Abraham thought he saw, just briefly, something that might have been a reckoning, the moment of a man who has built very hard and driven very hard, looking at the result in his son's face, and understanding that something in his architecture was incorrect. "Do not let her lose the cattle in another drought," his father said finally. "Diversify the breeding stock. The grass in the south pasture down toward the river is suited for a different breed than what she is running." It was the oddest gift his father had ever given him. Agricultural advice, offered about a woman he had been trying to dispossess 2 weeks earlier. Abraham took it in the spirit it was offered, which was complicated and indirect and nonetheless real. "Thank you," he said. He went back to the Maddox ranch that afternoon, and he did not leave. November came in cold and clear, with the particular hard Texas sky of autumn that goes blue all the way to the edges, and the ranch settled into its winter rhythm. The debt payments went on time, every month, managed with the careful precision that characterized everything Edna did. The restructured rate proved manageable with the revenue from the remaining cattle and a small additional income Edna had developed by supplying beef to 2 restaurants in the nearest town, Harlan City, which was 15 miles east and growing steadily as the territory filled in. Abraham worked. He had, in some formal sense, no position at the Maddox ranch. He was not hired. There was no wage arrangement, and the proprietorship was entirely Edna's. He had simply stayed and become useful, and neither of them had addressed the ambiguity directly because neither of them needed to, because the reason he was there was understood by both of them and did not require a business formalization to be real. He slept in the barn. He was clear with himself and with Clyde, and with anyone who might observe the situation, that this arrangement was exactly what it appeared to be: separate sleeping quarters, a respectful distance maintained, because Edna Maddox's reputation in the community was something she had built carefully over a difficult year, and Abraham was not about to let his presence complicate it. This was 1882 in Harlan County, Texas, and the rules around propriety were real and consequential, and she deserved the protection of them. What they had was what happened on the porch in the evenings, the long conversations that had become the best part of his days, and the occasional moments when the work brought them close enough that the warmth of someone you love, standing beside you, is its own complete thing. And the way she looked at him sometimes, when she thought he might not notice, with an expression that was the careful, guarded version of everything she felt. He noticed. He asked her to marry him in December. He had thought about how to do it for 3 weeks, and in the end it was not elaborate, because she was not a woman who wanted elaboration. She wanted honesty and straightness, and the specific respect of being asked rather than assumed. He asked her on the porch, on a cold December evening with stars sharp and close in the black sky, and he said, "Edna, I want to marry you, not because of the ranch or the business or any practical consideration. Because you are the only person I have ever met whose company makes me better, and I would like to spend the rest of my life in it if you will have me." She was quiet for a moment. "Abraham," she said. "Yes." "Are you going to keep telling me when you are wrong about things?" "Every time," he said, "and you are not going to try to take over the management of the ranch." "I will manage whatever part of it you want me to manage," he said, "and stay clear of the rest. And you understand that this is my land," she said. "In my name, that is not going to change." "I would not want it to," he said. She looked at him in the starlight, and then she said, "Yes, Abraham, yes." He kissed her, there on the porch, in the December cold, and it was nothing like the practiced, cautious version of himself that he had shown the world for 26 years. It was honest and warm, and she kissed him back the same way, and Clyde, who was inside by the fire and definitely heard what was happening, said nothing at all, which was the most elegant form of approval. They married in the spring on the 15th of April, 1883, in the Harlan City Methodist Church, which was a plain white building with clear glass windows and a minister named Reverend Cole who had a strong handshake and a talent for the essential. Clyde stood as witness. 2 of Edna's neighbors, the Vickers family who had the property 2 miles east, came with their daughter and their 2 sons. A handful of people from town attended because people from town attend things in small communities regardless of personal connection. Cyrus Ramsey did not come. Abraham had not expected him to. He had written to his father informing him of the date, formally and respectfully, and received a response that was 2 sentences. "I wish you well. Take care of yourself." It was, by Cyrus Ramsey's standards, warm. Edna wore a dress she had made herself from pale blue cotton that she had ordered from a dry goods catalog 6 weeks prior, and she had spent several evenings at the kitchen table with needle and thread that Abraham had watched from his place by the fire. And the result was something simple and exactly right, which he told her, and she said, "I know," with such serene confidence that he laughed. After the ceremony, they had a proper dinner at the vicar's suggestion, prepared in the church hall with contributions from several families in the community, because that was how things worked in small places, collectively, and the afternoon became warm and social in the way that only small community celebrations manage, where the people are few enough that everyone can speak to everyone, and the feeling is of something genuinely shared rather than performed. The drive back to the Maddox ranch that evening, the 2 of them side by side on the familiar road in the last of the April sun, was the quietest and most complete happiness Abraham had ever experienced. Edna rode next to him with her hand resting in his, just holding, not tightly, with the comfortable certainty of people who have chosen each other and know it. They built their life on that land. The debt to Cyrus Ramsey was paid in full by the following October, 14 months after the original crisis, every payment on time and correct to the penny. Edna brought the final receipt to the county office herself and filed it and stood in the county clerk's office, which was still manned by Percival Hatch, who had the same apologetic expression he always had, and she looked at the stamped confirmation that the Maddox land was fully and completely hers, and she allowed herself to feel it, the full weight of what she had fought for and won. That same week, she came home and found Abraham in the south pasture looking at the grass near the river with the thoughtful, calculating expression she had come to know meant he had an idea he was working out. "Your father told you something about this pasture," she said. He turned around. "How did you know that?" "Because you have been looking at it that way for 2 months and you are clearly trying to figure out if you should tell me," she said. He told her. He told her all of it, the breed suggestion, the grass characteristics, the conversation with his father in the study that day. She listened without interruption, and then she said, "He is not wrong." "No," Abraham said. "He is usually not wrong about cattle, whatever else he may be wrong about." "Write to him," she said. He looked at her. "Write to him about the breeding stock. Write to him about coming to dinner," she said. "He is your father. He is not a good man in many ways, but he is your father, and I am not going to be the reason you have no family." He looked at her for a long time. "You would have him to dinner," he said. "He would eat at my table and behave," she said, "or he would not be invited back, but yes. He is 60 years old and he agreed to the restructuring when he did not have to, and he offered you advice about the pasture, and those are small things, but they are something. Write to him," Abraham wrote. Cyrus Ramsey came to dinner that following Sunday, arriving in his best coat with a bottle of good Kentucky whiskey, and he sat at the kitchen table where Abraham had sat on that first impossible morning, and he ate the meal that Edna cooked, and he talked about cattle and land, and the particular challenges of drought management in the Texas Panhandle, and he was, on his best behavior, a person of considerable intelligence and experience who had a great deal worth saying. He and Edna did not become close. They were too different, and the history between them was too complicated for anything resembling warmth. But they arrived at a respect, an honest, professional, clear-eyed respect, that was more useful to everyone involved than pretended warmth would have been. He came to dinner occasionally. He offered advice when asked. He did not cross boundaries that had not been explicitly set, but had been made clear by the way two people carry themselves together when they are solid in their choices. In the summer of 1883, they diversified the breeding stock as Cyrus had suggested, investing in a small number of different animals that suited the south pasture, and the decision proved to be exactly right when a dry summer put pressure on the main pasture, and the south herd came through without significant losses. Edna wrote the numbers up in her record ledger with the meticulous care she brought to everything, and showed Abraham, and they sat at the kitchen table with the ledger between them, and both understood what it meant for the future of the ranch. In the autumn of 1883, Edna told Abraham she was expecting their first child. She told him at the kitchen table, in the morning, over coffee, which was appropriate because the kitchen table was where everything important in their life seemed to happen. He was quiet for a moment, and then he set down his cup and looked at her with an expression that she said afterward was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on any person's face, a pure, uncomplicated joy that had no calculation in it at all. He stood up and came around the table, and she stood too, and he held her, just held her, with the particular careful tenderness of someone who is suddenly very aware of everything precious. "Are you well?" he said into her hair. "I am very well," she said. "Are you frightened?" She considered the question honestly because she always considered questions honestly. "A little," she said. About the practical things. I am not frightened about the important things." "Good," he said. "Neither am I," Clyde, when told, took off his hat and held it against his chest for a moment in silence, and then said, "Robert Maddox would have been very glad," which was the most emotionally significant thing he had said in the 3 years Abraham had known him, and which required Abraham to go and look at something in the barn for several minutes before he could trust his own face. The baby was a boy. He arrived in the spring of 1884, on a morning in March when the weather had turned warm for 3 days, and the early wildflowers were visible on the south ridge. And he was healthy and loud, and Abraham was present for every part of it, which was not the universal custom in 1884, but was absolutely what he was going to do regardless. They named him Robert Abraham Ramsey, Robert for Edna's father and Abraham for the living one, which was a combination that Edna announced with such calm certainty that Abraham understood the name had been decided in her mind for some time, and was not a discussion but a declaration. He agreed entirely. Cyrus Ramsey came to see the baby 2 weeks after the birth. He held Robert with the careful, slightly awkward attention of a man who has not held a baby in 26 years, and the expression on his face was something Abraham had never seen there before, something open and undefended, something that might have been a door standing ajar in a house that had been very closed for a very long time. "He has your eyes," Cyrus said to Edna. "Yes," she said. "Your mother's, I imagine," he said, because he had known about the Maddox family longer than anyone in the county. "So I am told," she said. He handed the baby back with the same careful hands and said, "You are raising him right," which was not a small thing for Cyrus Ramsey to say, and Edna accepted it with the quiet, direct nod that she gave to all things that were sincere. The years that followed were the kind of years that look simple from the outside and are not simple at all, because any life with real substance is complicated in ways that the surface does not reveal. They worked hard. The ranch grew, slowly, with purpose and care, adding land when the opportunity was right and the price was honest, improving the cattle operation steadily. Edna kept the books and made the strategic decisions with the same disciplined intelligence she had always brought to the work, and Abraham brought the physical capacity and the specific skills of someone who had grown up doing this at scale. They were good partners. That was the word that fit before any other. Partners, in the real sense, where the abilities of one person fill the gaps of the other and neither requires the other to be something they are not. But they were also more than partners, more than the working arrangement that had built itself so organically from that first impossible morning. They were something that Abraham, who had grown up in a house where love was expressed primarily as expectation, still sometimes found difficult to understand that he had. He found it most clearly in the evening still, all these years on, when the work was done and supper was finished and then the babies, were settled, and they sat on the porch with their coffee and talked, or were quiet, and the Texas night was very large and very present around them. He found it in the way she still looked at him sometimes, when she thought he might not notice, with the full weight of what she felt visible in her face before she remembered that she was letting it show. He always noticed. He never said so out loud, because he had learned that she liked the privacy of her own face, but he felt it every time, that warmth, like a fire that has never once gone out through all the weather. In 1886, when Robert was 2 years old and walking and saying words with great confidence and no accuracy, Edna told him she was expecting again. This time she told him in the barn, because she had found him there in the evening doing something with the tack, and had simply appeared in the doorway, as she had done years ago, and said it directly. He crossed the barn and kissed her, which was still, all these years in, something that happened the same way the first time had, with complete honesty and no posturing, and she kissed him back the same way, and young Robert, who had followed his mother to the barn as he always did, looked at this display and said a word that was very clearly supposed to be Papa, and the moment broke into laughter. The second child was a girl. She arrived in the spring of 1887, and they named her Clara Me Ramsey. Clara for no particular person, but because Edna said it was a good name with a good sound, and Me because Abraham's mother, who had died when he was 7, and who he carried in his memory as warmth and softness and a particular kind of singing, had been named Me. When he told Edna this, when he explained the origin of the middle name, she looked at him with her full face open in a way she reserved only for the moments when something had moved her deeply, and she reached up and touched his face with her hand and said, "Then she will have a piece of her." And that was all, but it was enough, more than enough. Clyde Briggs lived on the Maddox Ranch until 1888, when his hip finally made his mobility too difficult for ranch work, and his niece in San Antonio wrote to ask if he would consider coming to live with her family. Edna and Abraham drove him to the rail station in Harlan City on a day in October, which felt appropriate, October having been the month that had changed everything. Clyde shook Abraham's hand and said, "You are a good man. You chose the right side." He embraced Edna with the brief, careful emotion of an old man who is trying not to show how much something matters to him, and she hugged him back without any such restraint. They watched the train leave and stood on the platform together in the cool October morning until it was gone, and then Edna slipped her hand into Abraham's and they walked back to the wagon. By 1890, the Maddox Ranch, which was still called by that name and always would be, had grown to 620 acres, with 400 head of cattle, a working water system that Abraham had designed and installed based on plans he had ordered from an agricultural engineering manual he had found in the Harlan City Library, and a reputation in the county for quality beef that brought buyers directly to their door rather than requiring a drive every season. They had 3 children by that year. Robert was 6 and already horse-mad and had a serious, practical way about him that was clearly inherited from his mother. Clara was 3 and the most socially confident small person either of them had ever encountered, capable of charming visiting cattle buyers with a directness that made grown men laugh helplessly. The third child, born in 1889, was a boy named Thomas Clyde Ramsey. Thomas because it was Abraham's grandfather's name, and Clyde because there was only one person that honor belonged to. When they wrote to tell Clyde Briggs of the name, the reply they received 3 weeks later was a single page in a handwriting that had clearly been produced with considerable effort and said, "I am more honored than I know how to say. Take care of each other and those children. I am well in San Antonio and my niece feeds me too much. Your friend, Clyde." They framed the letter and hung it in the kitchen, which was the right place for it. Cyrus Ramsey died in 1891 in the spring in his sleep, at 68 years old. He had been in declining health for 2 years, a fact he had disclosed to no one until it was no longer concealable, which was completely consistent with everything he had ever been. He left the Circle R to Abraham in a will that was straightforward and legally unambiguous, and he left a personal letter for his son that Abraham read alone on the porch of the Maddox house on the morning after the funeral. He did not share the letter with Edna that day, and she did not ask. She brought him coffee and sat with him while he was quiet with it, and eventually he said he was sorry in the letter. He said he was sorry about several things, and he described them specifically, which is more than I expected. "Good," she said. "He said you were a formidable woman and that he was glad you had not signed." She looked at him. "He said that?" "Yes," Abraham said. "He said he recognized it about halfway through that meeting in his study, but he was too set in his course to change direction, and he said he was glad I had more sense." She was quiet for a moment. "What will you do with the Circle R?" He had thought about this for 2 years, since it became clear that his father's health was declining. He had his answer ready. "Sell the parts of it that were acquired by methods I cannot stand behind," he said. "There are 3 parcels that came through contracts like the one my father had with your father that were pressed against people in desperate circumstances. I am going to find those families, if any of them still exist in the county, and make it right." She looked at him. That will cost a significant amount, she said. Yes, he said. The remaining land is legitimately acquired and well managed, he said. We can fold it into this operation or sell it or lease sections to families looking to start. I want to think about it carefully. She nodded slowly. Make it right first, she said. The rest will still be there after. He did. He spent 6 months working through county records, identifying the 3 parcels and the families who had lost them. 2 of the families were gone from the county entirely, their whereabouts unknown. He found them eventually through the patient, methodical work of letters to county clerks across 3 states. And what he found was not a simple situation, because years had passed and people had built new lives, and the return of land is not always the thing that was needed. But money sometimes can be, and restitution, and acknowledgement. The 3rd family was still in Harlan County, a Mexican-American family named the Garcias who had lost 30 acres in 1879 and were now tenant farming on land adjacent to what had been theirs. He returned the 30 acres to the Garcia family. He gave them the deed, signed over at the county office, with no conditions attached, and the response from the Garcia family, from Aurelio Garcia and his wife Rosa and their 4 children, was the kind of response that stays with you for the rest of your life because you see in it the exact weight of what was taken and what has been given back. Aurelio Garcia shook Abraham's hand for a long time without saying anything, and then he said, "Your father was not a just man, but you are, thank you." Abraham drove home with Edna, who had been present at the county office, and on the road back she said, "I am very proud of you." He said nothing for a moment because the words were simple and she meant them completely, and he felt them in a way that required a moment. "That is the best thing anyone has ever said to me," he said. She squeezed his hand on the seat of the wagon. The remaining Circle R land, about 8,000 acres, was divided carefully over the following years. They kept 2,000 acres adjacent to the Maddox property, adding it to their own operation to create a combined ranch of respectable size, managed with the same values that had defined the Maddox ranch since Edna took charge of it. The rest was sold or leased to new families at honest prices, which contributed to the growth of the community in a way that felt, to Abraham, like a correction, like something set back into its proper alignment. The Harlan County community grew through the early 1890s as the last of the frontier territory filled in, and with it came more amenities. A proper school in 1892 that Robert attended with the serious application of a child who has been read to every evening of his life. A doctor who established a permanent practice in Harlan City rather than visiting occasionally. A telegraph office. And the slow, inevitable arrival of the things that mark the end of one era and the beginning of another. Edna served 1 term on the Harlan City Agricultural Council, beginning in 1893, which was not a common thing for a woman to do in that time and place, and which she had been invited to do specifically because her reputation for practical knowledge and honest dealing had made her the person most likely to produce useful results. She was not the first woman to do such a thing in Texas, but she was one of the early ones, and she took the responsibility with the same unhurried seriousness she gave everything. Abraham supported this entirely, which required in practice very little, because she did not need his permission and had not asked for it. But what she did benefit from was his management of the ranch operations during her time in town for council meetings, and his complete and genuine enthusiasm for the work she was doing, which was different from mere tolerance, and she knew the difference. In 1894, when Abraham was 38 and Edna was 36, she told him she was expecting their 4th child. This in the kitchen in the morning, over coffee, as always. He looked at her across the kitchen table, and they shared a moment that was layered with all the years, all the mornings at this table, from that very first impossible morning when he had walked through her door with his father's instructions and his own growing uncertainty, and she had pointed at a chair and said, "Sit down." He thought about the distance between that morning and this one and felt the particular vertigo of understanding how much has happened, how much has been built, how much has been lost and recovered and changed. "Good morning," he said. She smiled. The full smile, unguarded, the one he had been waiting for on the 5th day and had never stopped being grateful to receive. "Good morning," she said. The 4th child was a girl born in the spring of 1895. They named her Edna Ramsey. Me for Abraham's mother, Edna for her own mother, and Ramsey for the name that now encompassed everything they had built together on land that had once been at the center of a conflict and was now at the center of a life. Robert was 11 that year, serious and capable, already working real ranch hours on school-free days. Clara was 8, still the most socially gifted person in any room she entered. Thomas was 6, and his primary interest in life was the horses, specifically the one gray mare in the south pasture that he had decided was his, despite no formal agreement with either parent about this. They were full. The house was full, and the days were full, and the life was full in the way that matters, with difficulty and joy and the particular beauty of a thing built honestly from difficult materials. In the evening, still after supper, after the children were in bed, after the day was set aside, Abraham and Edna sat on the porch with their coffee, and the Texas sky did what it had always done, going enormous and dark and full of stars, and they talked, or were quiet, as the evening required. One night in the summer of 1895, when me was a few months old and the night air was warm and the fireflies were working in the long grass beyond the fence, Abraham said, "Do you remember the first morning, when I came through the door?" "I remember everything about it," she said. "Were you afraid?" She considered the question, as she always considered things, fully and without rushing. "Not of you," she said. "Of what you represented, the situation, but not of you specifically." "Why not specifically?" he said. "I came in fairly aggressively." "Because," she said, and he could see her smiling in the dark, "you had a face that was not comfortable with what it was doing. A man comfortable with intimidation does not look like that." "What did I look like?" "Like someone who had been given a task and was discovering partway through it that he did not believe in the task," she said. He laughed. "That is exactly accurate." "I know," she said. "That is why I told you to sit down." "That is why I sat," he said. She put her hand into his, and the porch was quiet around them, and the fireflies moved in the long grass, and the stars over Harlan County, Texas, in the summer of 1895, were exactly what they had always been, enormous and patient and indifferent to the small bright lives beneath them, which did nothing to diminish those lives and perhaps said something about what it means to persist, to build, to love, in a world that is largely indifferent, and to do all of that anyway. With your whole self, without apology or condition. "Abraham," she said, "yes, I am glad you did not leave." He brought her hand up and pressed it briefly to his lips and then held it. "I am glad you pointed at the chair," he said. She laughed, the full warm laugh, and leaned against his shoulder, and they sat together on the porch of the Maddox ranch, which was both of theirs in every way that mattered, while the summer night held them, and above the dark edge of the western ridge the first stars of the late season were coming up, one by one, faithful and exact. Inside, a baby made a small sound and settled. The horses moved quietly in the paddock. Somewhere in the south pasture, a night bird called once and was answered. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. They had 4 children and a ranch, and a life built not from ease but from the particular courage of people who are willing to look at each other honestly and sit down at the same table and figure out what is true. They had built it from a debt and a bad loan and a father's desperate choice and a son's reluctant mission and one woman's refusal to be beaten. And all of those broken things had, in the end, become the foundation, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about foundations, that the best ones are made from what was broken and remade with more care. The moon was coming up over the eastern ridge, round and orange as a harvest lantern, and Edna said, "Beautiful," and Abraham said, "Yes," and he was looking at her when he said it. the story of the Maddox Ranch did not end that night. It went on, as life does, through more seasons and more decisions and more mornings at the kitchen table with coffee and ledgers and children growing into themselves. Robert grew into a young man of 18 who had his mother's eyes and his father's honesty, and a talent for the cattle trade that made buyers in Wichita and Amarillo specifically request to deal with him. Clara, at 15, had such a powerful personality that Edna had begun, cautiously, to wonder if the legal profession might eventually need to reckon with her. Thomas, at 12, remained primarily interested in horses, but had developed a secondary interest in the engineering drawings he had found in his father's agricultural manuals, and me was growing into a quiet, watchful, luminously cheerful child who seemed to find everything in the world interesting, which was a quality that both her parents considered the most valuable kind of intelligence. Edna kept the books and managed the operation. Abraham kept the land and the animals. Together they kept each other and the life they had made, which was, by any honest accounting, a great deal. There were hard years, because there are always hard years in ranching in Texas, and they navigated them the way they navigated everything together, at the kitchen table, with the ledger open and the coffee warm and the clear, practical intelligence of two people who have chosen each other for all the right reasons and know how to work. There were good years, too, the kind that expand in memory into something golden, when the cattle were healthy and the rains came right and the children were well, and the evenings were long and warm, and the porch was the best place in the world. And always at the center of it all, the kitchen table where it had begun. The table where a woman had pointed at a chair and said, "Sit down," without fear, to a man who had come to intimidate her, and the man had sat, because something in her steadiness had reached past his father's instructions and his prepared speech and all the armor he wore in the world, and found the part of him that had always known the difference between right and wrong and had been waiting for a reason to act on it. He never left. And that, in the end, was the truest and most important fact of everything that came after.